So Boeing, big disappointment to me. Big disappointment.
Say a 25% increase across the board on tariffs. Tit for tat from both sides.
Boeing didn't expect its crisis to come from Washington. For years, the aerospace giant weathered storms from technical failures, production delays, and global competition. But in 2025, the blow didn't come from a faulty jet or a rival in France. It came from a trade war unleashed by its own government. On May the 7th, a short internal message arrived at Boeing's Chicago HQ. The subject? Ryanair Withdrawal. It was just 2 words, but for Boeing's top brass, it was a red alert. Ryanair, one of Europe's largest and most loyal low-cost airlines, had suspended its next round of jet deliveries. And not because of engineering flaws or delivery delays. The reason was far more disturbing: tariffs. President Donald Trump's sweeping 25% tariffs on imported aircraft components had turned Boeing's financials upside down. Overnight, the cost of production skyrocketed. Contracts signed months or even years earlier were no longer profitable, and customers weren't willing to eat the extra cost. Real quick, if you're into videos that cut through the noise and break things down clearly, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people find this. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. We've got more deep dives coming your way. Also, drop a comment and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your take. Now onto the video. At first, Boeing hoped it was a one-off incident, but within hours, 3 more airlines followed Ryanair's lead. A Turkish carrier requested a full pricing re-evaluation. A Latin American airline froze payments. An African state-owned airline halted new negotiations. The message was clear. This was no isolated complaint. It was a global reaction. Boeing's leadership was rattled, but they shouldn't have been surprised. The signs had been there for months. Trump's tariffs didn't discriminate. They weren't narrowly aimed at Chinese rivals or EU imports. They hit Boeing's own global supply chain and international business model. This wasn't just a policy decision. It was a shockwave. And Boeing, long considered too big and too strategic to fail, was now caught in the middle of a political crossfire that threatened to collapse its global operations. Ryanair's decision to cancel its next round of deliveries wasn't just a business move, it was a warning shot. And inside Boeing, the signal was unmistakable. If one of their most loyal and price-sensitive customers was backing out, more would follow. And fast. Ryanair had been a loyal Boeing customer for decades. The low-cost carrier based in Dublin operated one of the largest 737 fleets in the world and had consistently ordered new aircraft to expand its services across Europe. The airline's entire model was built on efficiency and cost control, and it was precisely that financial model that Trump's tariff policies had disrupted. In its internal communication to Boeing, which was later leaked to the media, Ryanair's leadership stated that the new tariffs had fundamentally changed the commercial viability of the agreement. Their concern wasn't hypothetical. The 25% tariff on imported components had inflated the final cost per aircraft by several $1 million, costs Boeing was expected to pass on to its buyers. Ryanair refused to play along, and within 6 hours of the leak, the floodgates opened. A major Turkish airline announced it would be reassessing all procurement plans for the remainder of the year. A Latin American carrier requested a halt to production until price renegotiations could be completed. An African state-owned airline paused all new negotiations, explicitly citing US economic volatility as the reason. It wasn't just about Boeing anymore, it was about trust. Airlines operate in thin-margin environments, and sudden price swings can throw an entire year's financials into disarray. Customers needed predictability, and Boeing could no longer offer it. Inside the company, the mood shifted from concern to alarm. Emergency meetings were called. Executives debated how to handle the backlash. Could they afford to absorb the tariff costs? Could they find suppliers outside tariff zones quickly enough to stabilize prices? The answer to both questions was no. And while Boeing's public relations team scrambled to reassure stakeholders, the company's competitors were watching and moving. Airbus, Boeing's longtime European rival, seized the moment. The company began contacting customers who had expressed concerns over Boeing's pricing, offering faster delivery timelines and stable pricing unaffected by US trade policy. In some cases, Airbus reportedly offered discounts just to win over panicked Boeing customers. In the same period, China's Comac, a relative newcomer to the aviation scene, also saw a surge in interest. While Comac's jets were still considered inferior in performance, they were now being seen as a safe bet in terms of pricing and delivery. For emerging market airlines, that mattered more than brand prestige. Meanwhile, back at Boeing, CEO Kelly Ortberg faced mounting pressure from shareholders and the board. His previous statements, in which he had downplayed the impact of Trump's tariffs, were now coming back to haunt him. Just months earlier, he had confidently told Reuters that Boeing would benefit from the trade war. Now, he was presiding over the most sudden and public unravelling in the company's history. And this was just the beginning. When President Trump rolled out the 2025 tariff package, his goal was clear: punish foreign producers and bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States. But what he didn't expect, or perhaps didn't care to consider, was that many of those foreign components were vital lifelines for American giants like Boeing. And unlike a small apparel manufacturer that could move production back to the Midwest, Boeing's operations were tied to a global ecosystem decades in the making. That's where everything started to break. Trump's new tariffs included a sweeping 25% import tax on all aircraft components sourced from abroad, including allies like Japan, Germany, and Canada. Even more staggering was the 145% tariff imposed on goods from China. These weren't targeted strikes at specific competitors. These were indiscriminate bombs dropped on the entire supply chain of the aerospace industry. And Boeing? It was standing right in the blast zone. Internally, Boeing leadership had underestimated the risk. CEO Kelly Ortberg had publicly expressed confidence as late as January 2025, suggesting the administration's America First stance would benefit Boeing. His reasoning? Boeing jets are designed, assembled, and shipped from American soil. But what Ortberg overlooked was that the company's planes might be assembled in the US, but the parts came from everywhere else: landing gear from Canada, avionics from Germany, precision electronics from Japan, composite materials from China. The backbone of Boeing's aircraft wasn't a product of any single nation. It was the culmination of a 21st century global supply network, and Trump's tariffs struck it like a sledgehammer. It wasn't long before the European Union responded with fury. Within a week of the US tariffs going into effect, the EU unveiled its own list of retaliatory measures, valued at over $100 billion. And at the top of the list, civilian aircraft, Boeing jets. That marked a sharp departure from the past. Historically, civil aircraft had been off-limits in trade disputes, viewed as too vital to national security and diplomacy. But Trump had changed the rules, and Europe wasn't going to fight with one hand tied behind its back. The result was devastating. European customers of Boeing would now have to pay 25% more per jet just to import them into the EU. That extra cost was either going to be passed on to passengers, absorbed by airlines, or forced back onto Boeing itself. None of those options were sustainable. Back in Washington, D.C., Boeing began an aggressive lobbying campaign. Executives met with lawmakers behind closed doors, warning of mass layoffs and a rapid erosion of America's aerospace leadership if civil aircraft were not exempted from the tariffs. Ortberg reportedly called over 20 senators personally in a single week. The company's legal and PR teams went into overdrive. But the White House wouldn't budge. In fact, when the Senate introduced a bill to exempt aircraft from the tariffs, it failed, narrowly, by just 3 votes. The Trump administration responded to the effort with a blunt message. If Congress interferes with tariff enforcement, the administration would consider doubling the tariff rate. The message was loud and clear. This was a political hill the White House was willing to die on. And as political theatre played out in D.C., the damage was already being felt on Boeing's balance sheet. Airlines were beginning to explore alternatives. Airbus launched targeted ad campaigns highlighting the tariff-free advantage of buying European. Airlines that had traditionally preferred Boeing for its engineering pedigree were now reconsidering based on something far more important: stability. Investors began to pull back. Boeing's stock, once a pillar of the Dow Jones, dipped 11% in 2 weeks. Credit agencies downgraded Boeing's outlook from stable to negative. And inside the company, morale plummeted. Trump's tariffs may have been designed to punish foreign companies, but the unintended consequences were brutal. One of America's most iconic manufacturers was now losing business, market share, and political capital on a scale it hadn't experienced in decades. And the worst part? The supply chain issues were just getting started. If the customer backlash was the first crack in Boeing's armor, the collapse of its global supply chain was the full-scale breach. Boeing didn't just manufacture airplanes, it orchestrated the most complex supply chain in the world. Every aircraft was a feat of logistics, with over 1.5 million parts sourced from thousands of suppliers across dozens of countries. And every one of those suppliers now stood on shaky ground. The first domino to fall came from Canada. One of Boeing's long-term suppliers of landing gear systems announced it could no longer fulfill its contracts at current prices. The 25% tariff made its products uncompetitive, and the supplier had no capacity to relocate manufacturing to the US within any reasonable timeframe. Production paused. Next came Germany. A high-tech avionics manufacturer halted its shipments to Boeing while it sought legal clarification on how the US tariffs might impact compliance with EU regulations. In the meantime, Boeing was left scrambling for replacements. In Japan, things took an even darker turn. A crucial electronics supplier for Boeing's 787 Dreamliner withdrew entirely from a multi-year contract. The stated reason? Unpredictable commercial terms and an uncertain legal environment. Translation: it's not worth the risk. Boeing's response was swift but desperate. At its Dreamliner assembly plant in Charleston, South Carolina, managers ordered the stockpiling of all remaining inventory. In Wichita, Kansas, engineers were told to identify every single imported part at risk of tariff disruption and to source domestic alternatives where possible. But the truth was unavoidable. In many cases, there were no domestic alternatives. Take rare earth metals, for example. These elements are used in virtually every advanced component on an aircraft: flight control systems, jet engines, navigation electronics. The overwhelming majority of these materials are mined and processed in China. But in retaliation to Trump's trade war, China imposed export bans on rare earths, effectively cutting Boeing off from the lifeblood of its technological edge. And without those materials, Boeing couldn't build, not efficiently, not affordably, and not at scale. The internal chaos spread fast. Meetings became war rooms. Sourcing managers were working 14-hour days. Engineers were rewriting specs. And all the while, executives fielded urgent calls from airlines asking for delivery updates, calls they couldn't confidently answer. Meanwhile, Airbus was thriving. The French-based rival had its supply chain firmly rooted in Europe and, crucially, remained unaffected by US tariffs. Not only did Airbus absorb several of Boeing's panicked clients, but it also began cherry-picking suppliers who could no longer afford to do business with Boeing. Even Embraer, the Brazilian aircraft maker that had once considered a merger with Boeing, returned to the playing field. With Comac gaining traction in Asia and Africa, and Airbus dominating Europe and the Middle East, Boeing was watching its global market share shrink before its eyes. The supply chain Boeing had spent decades perfecting, one of the most complex logistical achievements in human history, was coming undone in a matter of weeks. And it wasn't just about planes anymore, it was about survival. By late May 2025, the numbers started to speak for themselves. Boeing had lost over $3 billion in frozen or cancelled orders. Nearly 25% of its overseas customers had paused or restructured contracts. But the real blow wasn't just financial, it was reputational. For decades, Boeing had symbolized reliability. Airlines bought Boeing jets not just for their engineering superiority, but for their dependability in cost, delivery, and long-term maintenance. That reputation was now in tatters. Airlines were no longer willing to gamble. Delta Airlines, one of Boeing's premier American customers, quietly postponed its 2026 procurement cycle. Lufthansa delayed its planned wide-body orders, explicitly stating it would await the resolution of trade disputes. Ryanair, already on the offensive, officially cancelled its remaining 737 MAX orders for the year, citing ongoing commercial uncertainty. Internally, Boeing calculated the new average tariff cost per aircraft, $3 million. Multiply that by a 100-jet order, and you get a $300 million wipeout, straight off the books. For a company that already operated on slim margins and relied heavily on volume, this was catastrophic. The board of directors was in disarray. Some pushed for drastic price cuts to hold on to key contracts. Others argued that undercutting margins would destroy long-term profitability. CEO Ortberg was caught in the middle, facing immense pressure from shareholders on one side and global partners on the other. But as Boeing hesitated, the sharks moved in. What happened to Boeing in 2020 wasn't just a corporate misstep. It was a perfect storm of political arrogance, economic retaliation, and strategic overconfidence. A company that once symbolized American ingenuity was brought to its knees, not by a product defect or a foreign adversary, but by policies made at home. The irony is brutal. In an effort to protect American industry, the government inadvertently crippled one of its most iconic manufacturers. The very tariffs designed to make America more competitive triggered a loss of contracts, a collapse in trust, and a flight of customers to foreign competitors. And the worst part? It didn't have to happen. Boeing's fall is more than just a headline. It's a wake-up call. In a global economy, walls built to protect can quickly become cages. No company, no matter how big, is immune from the unintended consequences of economic warfare. The question now is, what comes next? Because for the first time in decades, Boeing's future isn't written in blueprints or contracts. It's written in uncertainty. Once again, thanks for watching this video. If you got something out of this, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. And hey, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Agree, disagree, or something in between. I'd love to hear it.